Hey guys, welcome back to Thoth Thursday. I hope everyone's doing well. Today I want to talk about something a little broad. It's not something that's solely specific to the Thoth, but something that I use the Thoth for. So, if you've seen the title of this video, you know that I'm basically using today as a way to tell you guys how I use the Thoth Tarot to make me smart. Okay? And I've got a little affirmation here. I am smart on this post-it for a reason. Now, I don't mean smart as in a vain, conceited way. I use this deck to try to map out and conceptualize my own relationship with information, knowledge, and wisdom. And there aren't a lot of ways that I mean, there's not any like specific ways that I go about doing this, but if you're familiar with my Thoth Thursday playlist, you know that I like to ramble about certain revelations that I have with this deck. You know, it just is what it is. But now, granted, like I said, this is not solely specific to Thoth, but as this is my preferred deck, I guess you could say my preferred deck when it comes to these broad spectrum concepts, I tend to go to the Thoth. But it's technically the system itself of tarot, the structure itself of tarot, that allows me to utilize its archetypal concepts and universal laws to dig deep into the psyche, to dig deep into my own self-awareness. And there's certain ways that I look at those things, and there's a relationship that I have with those things that, like most things in your life, they tend to, like, they can wane and they can ebb and flow, you know? So now what do I mean by information, knowledge, and things like that? Well, with the universal laws and the fact that this to me is archetypal, but then it, you know, there's so many things that the structure of tarot covers that I'm talking spiritual awareness, my relationship to spirituality and deity, you know, things like that. My own personal values, that could be morality, that could be, it's like logistics on human nature. I am fascinated by human nature. Connectedness, the way in which I connect to myself, but then expand that into a web of connection with other people, other things, material things, and then the web of the universe as a whole, right? There's a connectedness that I feel ties everything together. So this is also helping me with connectedness, and it's helping me with cooperation, right? There's something about this deck that makes me think about the universe. There is a definite macro and microcosm here, which to me just means that on an earthly level, there's competition, right? We're in competition with everything that we do. There's a fight, if you will. Maybe it's an inner fight, maybe it's an outer fight, but there's a kind of a struggle between us and our relationship to the things that we perceive on this earthly plane. But if you broaden that to the macro level, you have to think about, are there those same struggles on the universal planes, on parallel universes, things like that. It's just, it's connectedness down to, that's the apex, right? But then when we broaden it out into the web, I guess I'm going to keep going with the web formulation analogy, there's a certain way in which we cooperate with the macro and the microcosm. And for me, it all boils down to knowledge and information and how we utilize that. So now, I'm sure that if you're watching this, you're already familiar with the structure of tarot. It has the major arcana, which to me are, I'm going to say 21, okay? Now, technically, there are 22 cards in the major arcana, but the full to me is especially in this particular deck, is unmanifest, which means that there's a negative pull to the Fool for me. There's a drawback that is coming from the bow of life. All right. He's not, the Fool isn't the archer. It is not the bow itself, and it is not the arrow. It is literally the drawback, the initialization of the drawback of the bow, which is separate than the bow, the arrow, and the archer. So he literally, to me, the Fool is not technically a personification. And if you are familiar with my own Thoth deck, which is the Wild Essence Thoth, you know that I very much visualize the Fool card in the Thoth system as like a black hole, right? Anyway, so if we put the Fool over here, then I kind of look at the rest of the major arcana as universal laws. This would be the macrocosm. And what I mean is I utilize the major arcana in this deck to visualize my connectedness and awareness with these universal concepts. And I highly recommend, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into the concept of universal concepts, to get the Tarot Handbook by Arrien. I believe that's how you pronounce their name. I will leave the link to the book below. Highly recommend that book. But I very much use the major arcana to think about universal concepts, macrocosm level stuff that through the web trickles down, literally ripples out and trickles down to the earthly plane of existence. And you could kind of look at that like the tree of life. It trickles down the tree of life. It can bleed up the tree of life. Either way it goes, there's a flow of these universal concepts. And it's how I want to relate to that, right? So, for example, we could say, for instance, the magician is maybe power or self-reliance. Self-reliance. We'll say self-reliance. To me, self-reliance is about individuation, okay? But not in a Jung, in a Carl Gustav Jung way. More in a way that this is probably the beginning, right? So for me, I would try to plug in an analogy. Like when I was talking about the Fool, I talked about the archer, right? The bow and the arrow. What would the Magus be then, right? I believe the Magus probably would be the archer. So it's just like things like that I think about. I try to plug an analogy down to help me formulate a relationship with each card, but also its universal concept. The universal concept just means that it relates to every single thing in existence. So what do you think about anything? Even if it had a parasitic, symbiotic relationship with something else, most things stand alone at some point. Okay? And we have to, excuse me, we have to think about, I think about those things. This form of the fact that even if it relates to other things, there's still an individualization about that thing. So like I said, for instance, that's the Magus, okay? And then we get down, we come through the major arcana, and the Empress to me, of course, is compassion. Compassion goes for everything in the universe. You can find compassion on both macro and microcosm levels. Okay, what's the Chariot? Especially in this context where the charioteer, I guess you could say in this case, is holding the Holy Grail here. To me, this is about courage, but it could also, and there's a light and dark to the tarot, especially to the archetypes that live in the tarot. There's a light and shadow side. And for me, courage has beautiful associations, but then also, on the other side of things, there could be blind reaction in times of courage. So again, find courage in all manner of life. Let's see. Here's the Hanged Man. Now, I like this because I believe the Hanged One to be about independence. But independence different than the Magus. The Magus being self-reliant and knowing that it has a relationship to other things and will have many relationships with many things, but then also understanding the fact that they themselves are one being. But then the Hanged One would be this inner sense, a little bit more of an inner sense of independence, a reliance on the self that incorporates the relationships that they have. I love art too, especially in this, because prudence is a virtue. And when we're talking about alchemy and we're talking about this particular card and this particular deck, art is about the alchemical process, the melding of these two into one. So we've been talking about the one for this whole video so far. And how it's almost at the end of the major arcana that we have the marriage of this. We finally, after we've dealt with our own sense of independence, we go through this sort of radical transformation, right? And this rebirth that is, I believe, means that once we've gone through the transformation, okay, we have to go through the transformation. The transformation exists inside this cauldron. We have to remix, right? And it's like whatever's in the cauldron, all the relationships we've had, the knowledge, the information, things like that, we plug all that back out to rebuild a new version of ourselves. So there's just some sort of universal melding and adaptation that happens in this card, that happens on a universal and earthly level, okay? Macro and micro. So that's what the major arcana is to me, okay? Cosmic awareness there in the universe. This being aware of the minuscule, but then the huge expansiveness of the universe and the cosmos, which is a beautiful thing. Okay, and then we have the 4 suits. Now, the 4 suits in the tarot talk about various things, okay? And to me, each one can relate to anything that happens in our lives, right? In our lives in any kind of capacity. It just happens to divide it up into suits. It divides it up into categories and genres and subgenres here, okay? And it all kind of plays a role. But when we're talking about knowledge and information, okay, I want to be smart and I want to know the difference. And while I use universal concepts and the macrocosm with the microcosm and what my experiences are, and I churn the cauldron that is in me, but then also have to value the cauldron that is the entire swirl of the universe, I have to think about the relationship that all of it holds with information, knowledge, and wisdom. Those 3 key aspects. So, and this, because of the relationship I already have and I've already established with the macro and the microcosm, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and ask myself what my relationship is to knowledge, data or information, and wisdom, and how those 3 key phrases or those 3 key words radiate out as well. Okay? So, move this to the side over here. And again, this is just my trimmed version of this. And I'm using I Am Smart as a affirmation to hold in the back of my mind for this reading. Okay, now I know at the beginning of this, I didn't say we were going to do a reading, but we're technically going to pull some cards and we're going to see what they say, because I really want to stress what I'm talking about here. Now, information, or the definition, some keyword definitions for the term information is description. Description could be a definition, but it's really perspective, okay? This is all information is. It is a description of something, a definition of something, or a perspective of something. Now, perspective, you might think is an opinion. Very well could be. Information could be someone's opinion, and they've put it in the form of information as like a teacher might, right? And we have to be able to differentiate between the information that is a fact and the information that is an opinion. So there's a lot melding in the cauldron that is the key word of information, okay? But really, what information, besides those words I just said, definition, what were they? Description, definition, or perspective. Data, / information, are about answering the age-old questions. But information itself answers the questions who, what, when, and where. That's what information is. When it is information. Again, could be an opinion, could be a fact. It's up to us to know the difference. It's up to us to use our brains and know the difference, right? And so when I am faced with something that would seem to be in the informational category of life, where maybe I don't know how I feel about that little plug of information that I'm getting taught or I'm getting told, right? Sometimes we get told information, and instead of taking it in blind faith, there's a physical act in which our brain has to be able to interpret what we've just seemingly learned through a pocket of information, right? So, how do I want to answer who, what, when, and where? And that goes there, okay? Now, knowledge is different than information. Because like I just said, once we're faced with information and answering the question who, what, when, where, in order to be smart, okay, because that's the affirmation I'm holding in the back of my brain, we then have to take information and turn it into knowledge. How do we do that? How do we sustain a relationship with the term knowledge? Well, we have to develop some kind of strategy on how to think about this. A strategy on how to interpret the information. And then we have to practice the information somehow. So say we're learning something, for example, we're learning something about art. Or like in the Thoth case, say we're learning about projective geometry, which is a form of geometry that has been utilized since the 15th century for artists to be able to draw 3D on 2D paper, okay? Using geometry to formulate 3D images, okay? So anyway, and Frida Harris utilized that in this deck. So say we're learning this. We're not really going to learn it until we put it into practice. Even if that's not something that we're gonna like utilize forever, okay? Putting pen to paper or writing it down, physically writing it down or drawing it out in this case, getting a ruler and drawing it out, the planes and the subspaces and things within projective geometry, is when our brain will be able to sponge that. So information is kind of like petroleum jelly on top of a sponge. It's not really sinking in. It just lays on the surface of our brain. And it's up to us to somehow use the information and turn it into water, transform it in the cauldron and turn it into water to where it would sink in. Let's sink it in somehow. Find a way to sink it in. So that's what I want to ask the cards. Okay? How can I mix information up in my brain to allow it to sink in better? Again, this could be strategy, practice, a method or an approach to the information. We have to be able to formulate some kind of method or approach to be able to utilize the information. You have to be able to utilize it. Otherwise, it gets lost. And it's a permanent patch of petroleum jelly that we just never deal with. And then what does that do? Pretty soon, our entire brain is made up of petroleum jelly and nothing's getting synced in, you know? But what does knowledge answer? Knowledge answers the question, how? How is this information affecting me? How is this information not affecting me? How am I perceiving? How am I describing? How am I defining the information? And you have to have some form of self-reliance. So, what is my relationship to the term how? Oh, well, that wants to go at the bottom. We'll do it like that. Okay. Now, last but not least is wisdom. Okay, because we're expanding here. We're expanding the reading. We're expanding our own our own relationship with these three key terms. And this deck specifically really helps me to do that. Okay. Now, the last term is wisdom. And once we have information and then we find a method or a practice or some kind of strategy to deal with this information, to allow it to sink in, we have to somehow turn that into wisdom. Now, a lot of people, I guess, I won't say a lot of people, in terms of research and in terms of all that I've known about the term wisdom in and of itself, there's some sort of internalized, it's a method, but it's deeper than that. And I always had a problem with the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And maybe that's why I love this practice so much, is of trying to have knowledge, but have data, have knowledge, because knowledge is power. But then it's how you use that power. How are you going to use the power of wisdom, right? And what the difference is, and it's just all kind of confubbled in my brain ever since I've been in school. So what really is wisdom? So far we've answered the question who, what, when, where, and how. So wisdom is about laying down principles, laying down your own insight, okay? Your own interpretation of the descriptions and definitions and strategy. You have to have some kind of insight, some kind of light bulb, right? But you have to give yourself ample opportunity to allow the light bulb to happen, the light bulb to turn on, right? But you should have some kind of principle thought, principle insight. What about archetypal insight and moral, right? There's an awareness that you must awaken for wisdom. So what could be my relationship with wisdom? What is my relationship to the question wisdom asks, which is, why? That's the question of wisdom. You can have all the information and the who, what, when, where you want. And then you can actually turn that and churn that in the cauldron and ask how. How is this possible? How is this information? Blah, 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 blah. How does it teach me this? But if you don't ask the question why, you're not actually turning that into wisdom. It just sits on the surface and it sinks in, but not to the point of clarity, not to the point of wisdom. It's not wisdom yet until you have insight, until you ask the question, why? I think that's so profound that all these the six main questions of life that we always have, seem to have, Do we ask why? Do we ask why? Children ask why. Why do humans seem to unlearn the word why? Are we taught to not use why? Are we taught by our parents that don't want to answer our questions that maybe why is a bad word? Right? So, what's my relationship to the question why? How can I formulate a better relationship with insight, archetypal awareness in general? How can I ask the question why more? All right. Now, put that right there. Now let's go back to information. Information is my relationship to how things are described to me, defined to me, and what the perspective is of that. Okay, so this is information. I've got the Three of Cups. Now, the key word for this that I happen to know, you can't see it, but it's abundance. And I feel like that is so perfect for information, because in terms of propaganda, information, the internet, information is at our fingertips at all times. At all times. And there's a lack of patience, okay? A lack of patience in today's society. And I've been thinking a lot about this as my kids get more into social media, especially TikTok and the quickness of TikTok. And I thought about the way in which my children's generation is different than my generation, and how there was a lot more sit around and wait. In my generation, we had to wait for the TV to come on, an episode to come on the next week. We had to wait a whole week for another episode of TV. We had commercials in between TV shows. We had to boot up our internet. It wasn't just readily available. And, if we were on the internet, we couldn't be on the phone, right? There was just a lot more waiting, a lot more opportunities for us to learn patience. And now it's not like that. Everything is readily available to us. And I think that it's even more imperative to find our relationship with this. And I kind of like that if we use the Three of Cups in a broader way, like what we see in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, which is, three people dancing and drinking, blah, blah, blah. This could mean have a little bit more conversations about current events and spiritual concepts. Have more deeper connections with others that will allow you to allow you to talk through the information that's been given us, right? Instead of just absorbing all the information, taking it all in, and instead of taking the information as a grain of salt, okay, we can utilize our relationships with others and things, concepts, material things, to learn about the information, to learn more about the information. And I think that abundance here is the key word, should be the key word in terms of information. Knowing when we've had too much information and step back from that. Unplug, right? Get off your phone. Get off TikTok. Do something that will, like read a book, right? Like, I'm not telling you to get off TikTok and read a book. It's like, I'm not trying to dictate. I'm just trying to say that if we were to kind of turn the onslaught of information that we get, the abundance of that, and try to churn that in the cauldron to fill up abundance that is that word in other areas, right? Like, abundance doesn't mean you're full of just one thing. It could mean all kinds of things. So find other ways in which you're abundant than just the information onslaught. So anyways, okay. Then the next concept here is, or the next key term is knowledge, right? So what's my relationship to building a strategy, building a practice or method or some certain approach to the onslaught of information that I get on a daily basis? Now, this is interesting because here we got the Ten of Wands. And usually, to me, this is about a weight on our shoulders that's oppressive in nature. Actually, that's the key word for this particular card. But it's more about the oppressiveness that we allow, in my opinion. Like, we want to succeed so bad that we put all this stuff on our backs. I love the way that these particular pips are mapped out, because it always reminds me of having all these swords or all these wands on my back. Like how I'm going to utilize all my accomplishments as a shield, but then complain that my back hurts, right? It's like, shit, take some shit off your plate, It seems simple enough, but then when you try to formulate it into a practice, you can't. It's so easy to tell someone else, I think you should do this instead of this, and maybe you'll feel better. But then you don't take your own advice, right? And I think that's the message of this card, especially when we're in the wand suit. We're in this, let's do, right? Let's be passionate and let's create and da-da-da-da-da. But we have to acknowledge when we're overcooked, or specifically overcooking. We're not being overcooked like we are in a sword suit. We are overcooking something. We're cooking something to death. And we have to know when something's finite, when something's finished. And so my relationship with knowledge is when I strategize or when I try to force something or put something into practice, that I shouldn't force it. Don't overcook it, right? Allow it to permeate and then back off. And then allow a little bit more of a freedom with it, right? I'm just like going off of what this means to me, this oppressive card. It takes some stuff off my plate, right? To allow the strategy to come about. All right, and then the last one, of course, is wisdom. What's my relationship to the why of it all? The why principle. What's my relationship to insight? What's my relationship to archetypal awareness? Am I aware, right? Ooh, look at that. Oh, okay. I don't really, I'm trying to conceptualize using these two, how cool it is that I got the Magician here for wisdom. Because self-reliance and power, to me, willpower, utilizing what I have at hand, is so important for wisdom, right? Because it's like, okay, who, what, when, and where. There's an abundance of ways I can get to that information and get to that data and answer those questions, those 4 questions. But then the how always seems to oppress me. The how of the abundance seems to oppress me, and I have to learn how to deal with that. But it's like the Magician is looking back on all these cards and saying, well, in order to be wise, you have to know these things about yourself. Know the relationship that you have with knowledge and information and data. And there's the question that wisdom asks is why. I am the reason why. It's because I need to form better relationships, have more power, know my own power, right? Know and be wise about my own power with my relationship to the other two. I think that's pretty cool. So, I am smart, you are smart, everyone is smart, okay? But I just wanted to come on and share a little bit about how I use Thoth Tarot to make me smart. And how I love to pull cards like this for these like fascinating topics. I tend to go to this deck with these philosophical, spiritual, I don't know, connectedness, all these concepts that seem to rattle my brain on a philosophical level. I tend to go to the Thoth with these kinds of questions and these kinds of concepts, and like where I want to like really just pull cards and journal and stuff like that. So like if we were to just like keep doing this, I mean, how cool is the Ace of Swords here for wisdom, but then futility, knowledge being futility, uselessness. It's like, okay, I'm laughing out loud at this. But then wealth being information. That's not the same thing that we just got, right? Keep going here, right? Look at all this orange. Think about if we had had this. Tower for wisdom. You know, constantly being, if you want to be wise about something, you're going to live perpetually in a tower moment, right? But then the Emperor being so stoic here for information, it just is so perfect, right? Art. Nine of Cups. That's cool for knowledge. And then, of course, the beautiful Queen of Wands is definitely the wise queen, right? She's not. I'm not calling her the wise queen. I'm just saying in that context for wisdom, you know. The Wheel of Fortune being in the middle. Like, how perfect is that? Like, we could just keep doing this. I could keep doing this all day and just keep journaling about what these 3 cards mean in terms of information, wisdom, and knowledge. And a lot of things can come up, and especially if I'm doing it in terms of like automatic writing, where I'm just like looking at the cards, utilizing the 3 key terms and what all that means. It basically, stuff starts flowing. Strategies start to happen. And, you know, that's how I utilize this deck to be smart. So, I hope that this was not too confusing. I hope this was fun. And if you pull 3 cards for information, knowledge, and wisdom, let me know what they are below. And I'd love to see what that means for you. So, happy Thoth Thursday. Hope to see everyone again on the channel soon. Much love.